All right, hey everybody. Welcome back into Lightroom with me, Stefan. I have a couple new images I imported here, and today what I want to talk about is just a recap of some of the things that I briefly went over during our last Lightroom videos. And primarily what I want to talk today about is editing color in black and white. And so I have a couple images that I want to use to illustrate editing color and black and white and using color controls to edit black and white tones. So one of the things that we're discussing in this learning module 4 is the use of formal elements and principles in photography. So in the lecture and in some of the content, we're talking about contrast, tone, all these different sort of aesthetic tools that we can use. And tone and color are two of the things that are really the most fundamental in image making, whether it's photography or painting. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. So today, let's go ahead and open up an image with me after you watch this or as you watch this, and pick an image that has some strong colors and hopefully a few different strong colors. So here I have these really strong oranges and yellows, and then I have some blues in the sky. And then over here I have some really intense greens, some oranges and purples, and some yellows. So I have a variety of colors in these two images, and of course I've edited them up a little bit already just for the sake of this demo. So let's go ahead and move over into the develop module. And the first thing I want to talk about is recapping on things like white balance. So in this image, there's a lot of artificial light, right? There's light coming from down here. This is a hotel in Miami, and we have lots of different colors of light in this image, right? And one of the things that our white balance does, whether it's here in Lightroom or in our cameras, is white balance function is to try to balance the color in your image by picking something that is a gray point, right? Taking a type of reading and balancing all the colors based on that gray or white. So we pick a neutral tone, right? And we tell the computer or the camera's computer that that is gray and to balance all the colors from that. So of course we have some presets that try to do that based on inputs that we've preordained. So daylight obviously being balanced in a certain way. And over here under white balance, one of the things that you should have listed is as shot. And that's the way that your camera perceived it at the time when you photographed it. I default to auto a lot of the time because it does a pretty good job. But sometimes I want to go for a different feel, or I need a slightly different cast. So what I can do is I can adjust my temperature and tint settings manually, which are the two controls that we use to edit color, or white balance color, I should say. The other thing I can do is I can use this little eyedropper. Now you have to be careful with this because what this is really for is when you have a reference point in your image to pick a truly neutral color, white or gray. And if you ever see people in photography studios holding a color card with a bunch of colors on it, or a gray card that's a flat gray piece of cardboard, they use that card to reference here. So let's say I want to tell the computer that this window is white, right? This area in this bright window, that's white, that's neutral. And I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to click on that, and it will change my image based on that neutral color. And it will try to balance my color in my image based on that point. So this is another way that you can control your image, right? So if I tell the computer that this green over here is neutral, then it's going to shift everything based on that as though that green was gray. And now look at my image, it's crazy purple. Kind of fun, really. And you can see the temperature and tint changing as I do that. Now I have to click one of these sample colors in order to do this. But what's cool about Lightroom is I can just click on this little eyedropper and move it around. And as I'm moving it around, I have a little preview over here under my navigator. And if you can't see this thing over here, maybe it's collapsed down, but if you open these little things up with these little arrows, you can have this navigator tool open, and as you're hovering with your with your eyedropper for your neutral white balance picker, your navigator on the left here will show you what it's going to look like. So that's actually pretty close, right? Let's say that this wall right here is neutral gray. It's actually not, it's a green gray. But if I had to click on it, it gets me pretty close to actually what my camera originally thought, which looks like that. Well, that's the auto. Camera shot it like that, a little bit bluer. So you can see if you pick a neutral tone, you can get pretty close. See, that looks pretty gray right here in my little neutral zone. Yeah, there you go. So I'm going to go ahead and warm that up a little bit. And what I'm looking for right now is I'm actually looking for a diversity of sort of cool greens and warm oranges, just to sort of get a dynamic set of colors for what I'm about to do next. Okay? Because what I'm going to do next is scroll down, and I'm actually going to close down this Basics tab. There is a vibrance and saturation slider. I went over these in brief in the introduction to editing. I will say this again, and I will continue to say it. Do not be the person that turns in photos like this. This is obnoxious. It's horrible. It looks like the internet in 1998. Some of you probably weren't around yet. And you know, overdoing general color editing here is just such a rookie mistake. So you know, use these things in moderation. Really, where good color editing comes in is really getting your white balance dialed in, getting your highlights, shadows, and your basic editing, your global editing down pat, and then this next thing that we're going to do. So I'm going to close down this basic tab right here, and I'm going to skip a few down. I'm going to skip past tone curve, and I'm going to come down to HSL and color, right? And if you remember HSL/color, the HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance, right? These are three components of color. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open this up. And you might see them all like this in a list where you have hue, saturation, and luminance all together. Or you can just do one at a time like this, and it's only one little group of sliders. You just need to make sure that you know which one you're in, okay? And as I said before, each of these control a range of overlapping colors, right? The red goes into the orange goes into the yellow goes into this sort of green, the green goes into the aqua, and so forth and so on. So these are overlapping channels of color represented in your image, okay? Hue is the type of color, saturation is how much or how little of that color, and luminance is the brightness or the white or dark point of that color, okay? So what I want to do now is take a look at this image, all right? I got my white balance there. You know, my color is, it's not an all magenta picture. I have a nice range of sort of cool greens and these warm tones. It's kind of a surreal image, but the color doesn't look off. It just looks kind of wild. And you can see here that I've actually already made some adjustments. Before I opened this up, I made these adjustments, right? I've adjusted the luminance of these colors, so some of them pop. And I've adjusted the saturation a little bit, so some of them are a little bit more saturated in color. And I've pretty substantially altered some of the colors individually. Now, if we were to go back to the Basics tab and go to our white balance and temperature and tint, when you do this, this is a global edit, right? You can change, and it changes everything to some extent, right? But if I go down to my hue, saturation, and luminance sliders, I can affect these colors individually, right? With some overlap, keep that in mind, right? But let's start with the hue, right? The hue is the kind of color, right? So the kind of green, or how yellow or how blue is my green, right? So there's a lot of prominent greens in here. So I'm going to take that green slider, I'm going to move it all the way to the left, right? And my palm trees get kind of yellow. And all my green tones start to change. If I go the other way, my green tones start to get really blue. But there's some areas where there's overlap, right? In my yellows, you can see around the edges of the trees, there's some yellow fringe, right? So you have to be careful not to overdo this, because if I zoom in here, I can see in the movement of those leaves in my long exposure, they created some color cast around. And if I really go crazy, that starts to get weird, right? Especially over here. Look at that. Ugh, that looks horrible. Nasty. So I'm going to come back from that yellow a little bit. Okay. If I go the other way, ooh, now doesn't look natural either. So again, I have to be careful when I'm adjusting these. I can't go too crazy, right? You reach the limits of the computer and of the data. You push it sort of up against each other in such extremes, it starts to get nasty. But that being said, I can really, warm up certain areas of my image, cool off other areas of my image. So here I'm going to pull my purples. And you also might be surprised to see where some of these colors are, right? You might point at an area of an image and say, well, there's not a whole lot of red in there, but there actually is a lot of red in there. Or there isn't. Like look at my purple-gray sky, but it's got a red cast to it, actually. And so when I really pull these two extremes, I see that. So maybe subtle changes in those things actually create a more interesting and compelling image. When you look at this image, you don't see a lot of orange per se, but really it's one of the sliders that most deeply affects my photograph. And you'll actually notice that quite often. The orange and the blues actually generally affect the image quite a bit. So I'm going to get it somewhere there. Okay. Next, let's go over to our saturation side. Right? Again, saturation is how much of a color. Right? So if I don't like that the greens are really intense in these images, I want to tone them down, kind of make the trees look a little bit dead. I can bring that green down. There's still color there. Let me try my yellows. Bring my yellows down. Okay, it affected it a little bit. What about my aquas? Ooh, there we go. Really getting rid of that color. Now, that looks kind of weird. I don't like that at all. But it's a way to go. Or I can go the other way and really bump those greens and aquas and make these trees look almost like radioactive. Come over back to my hue, change my greens to be a little bit more on the blue side or the aqua side. So I can change where certain colors are appearing and not appearing on my image to a certain extent with these saturation sliders. Take the color out of the building and make it look kind of gray and ominous. So now the only color that's kind of there is my palm trees. That's pretty spooky. The last thing that you can do is the luminance, right? How bright or dark those colors are. We see here, right, my aqua really brightens those trees, makes them really pop, takes that color and introduces more light into it, more exposure, more white. And if I go the other way to the left, it darkens them, right? That looks really strange. So these are just ways that you can adjust the color more selectively in your photograph. Now, if we're going to leave it right there, which is a little bit too much for my liking, but we can leave it right there. I'm going to bring back some orange real quick. I'm going to remember for a second that I have some of these colors in this image, because I have these trees that are really, really bright, sort of neon aqua green. And then I have these really orange and yellow tones in this building, and I have some purple red in my sky. All right? Those are the colors that are prominent in my photograph right now. Let's scroll back up to basic, drop that down, and right here where it says treatment, if you remember, if you want a black and white image, you click right here where it says black and white. All right? Don't go down here and just desaturate your image. That's the no-no. That's a bad way to do it. You want to go here to black and white, where it truly converts all of the color information into tones. And this is really important because color actually affects black and white tonality, right? I think I mentioned this before, but the way that we see certain colors in black and white are different. Right? It's not just about the light, the brightness, right? It's not about the luminosity necessarily. Certain colors appear different tones and can change depending on how you perceive color in the first place, right? Talk to someone who's colorblind or color impaired in vision, and they can discuss this with you. So as I change my white balance, you'll notice that my tones change, right? Just because it's black and white, that doesn't mean that color editing can't affect my tones. And this is because as we change our white balance, right, if you remember, by changing our white balance, we change the color of our image pretty substantially, right? And so when we go to convert that image to black and white, those different colors are represented by different tones, right? So as a magenta sky goes to a green sky, right, things become darker, right? And as you warm your image up, it might become brighter. It really just depends on how those tones are being treated in the image, but color information affects tonal information, right? There's a whole science behind this, and more advanced color theory courses, especially in the case of photography and digital editing, would reveal the physics behind that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. All that you need to know is that you can affect tonality with color editing in Lightroom, right? So obviously our white balance, tint, and temperature can change the tones, right? I might find that this white balance, temperature, and tint setting looks really great in black and white. But if I go back to color, whoa, it's really orange, right? That's so strange. But here's why, right? These orange tones and these green tones are so separate from one another color-wise. And if you go to black and white, right, they're still separate, but they're not as separate as they used to be, right? So color is represented differently in black and white. Right? So here, this black and white temperature and tint combination for a white balance produces a really nice black and white, but in color, horrible. Let's move down back to our hue saturation sliders, except, oh no, look. When we're in black and white, there's no more hue, saturation, and color slider. It's now B&W, standing for black and white. So whenever you have converted the treatment of your image from a color to a true black and white image, your hue saturation sliders and luminance sliders change to B&W sliders, black and white sliders, right? And so now you're just limited to one set, right? Those colors, and they affect the brightness or darkness of those colors in your image now, right? And these are obviously dependent upon how those colors are represented through your white balance, right? So remember, before you can see it with this really bad color editing, but it's really orange right in here and really green right here, but in black and white it looks really great, all right? So now if I go down to my orange slider, look at how substantially it affects my image. Because with my white balance global adjustments that look good in black and white, I've made that image really orange casted, right? It's like using a hard blue filter on a film camera, resulting in really orange tones, right? So now, the orange slider really affects my image a lot. And of course, I remember those green trees were really bright too in my black and white balance setting. So I can affect those a lot too. Wow, make those really pop. That's crazy. So now I'm going to bring down my yellow setting a little bit. Because there's a lot of yellow in those greens too. Yellows and greens overlap a lot in plants, you'll notice. So now I can make the building look really dark. The trees look really bright. What about my blue slider? Nothing. Because you remember, again, with the basic adjustment of temperature and tint that we did for our black and white image, in color, it was mostly orange and mostly green. So in black and white, because there weren't any blues to really edit, my blue slider doesn't really do a whole lot. Right? Now, that being said, let's go back here to color really quick and adjust my white balance so that there's a lot of blue back in my image. Okay? Let's go like this. All right. Now there's a lot of blue cast in my image, right? A lot of blue in the sky, a lot of blue here. Maybe it'll come off a little bit. Okay. Now we got a lot of blues. So now if I convert this to black and white, looks pretty good still. It's different, a little flatter, a little darker. I come down here to my slider and I move my blues. Now that blue does a lot. Whereas before, a minute ago, when my temperature and tint and color produced a really, orange and green cast, and then in black and white, my blue slider didn't do anything because there's no blue. Now that I have an image where there's a substantial amount of blue in the color image, the black and white version allows for a lot of blue editing because there's a lot of blue in my image that can be edited now, right? But because it's so blue, the only thing that's really orange in that image in color is these windows, right? So if I go back up, convert it back to color, and take a look, the only really orange things are these windows in the hotel. And when I convert it to black and white and adjust those oranges, you really only see the change in those windows and a little bit in the sky over here in the cloud. Trees are still green, so they still change. Okay. Now, this is such a profoundly awesome way to edit, and you can get lost in this for a long time. You can use auto settings if you want, although they don't always do a good job. I encourage you to play with these. I encourage you to push them to their limit and then come back off of them, because that's how you're going to know really where the limits are. Right? Zoom into your image and see where the pixels start to break down. This long exposure image, I wanted the trees to move to get this really hazy view of these moving palm fronds. Right? So I'm gonna really pump a lot of contrast in there. Right? Up my greens a lot and bring my aquas down to the point where it's like, ooh, not good. Getting that hazy halo again. Okay, let's come off of that a little bit. Okay, that's not so bad. And in black and white, again, you can go back up to your temperature and tint and adjust these things without converting it back to color. Of course, you have to remember that as you do this, you're affecting how these already now moved sliders are being affected in the image. Now that I've gone back and adjusted my white balance, now my sliders are producing a really wacky look. So I might have to zero them back out and start over with a different white balance. So it's a good idea to find a pretty good starting point in color that you think might be good, or in black and white that might be good, and go from there, right? Get a good global adjustment. For me, getting a good separation of my trees to my background is really key. And the reason for that is I want to be able to edit them separately in my color sliders. So I'll make my background kind of blue, orange, and then these trees really green and aqua, so that when I convert it to black and white, those colors are so separated that when I come down here, I can really push the difference. And there's different ways that you can adjust these and different arrangements, and there's really no right or wrong way. It's really just the style that you're going for. Really, the only things that you want to look out for is producing bad, grainy, posterized, hazy, halo-y artifacts by pushing these things too far. And then, of course, you can balance this out with the last thing I'm going to talk about today, which is split toning. If any of you have ever played around with film or maybe Polaroid, split toning was something in color photography that we could do in the darkroom or in film processing, where we would produce color casts across the image. So if we were to convert this back to color and go down to split toning, what split toning does is it applies a hue of color to the highlights and shadows. So on the shadows, if I wanted to get like a really dark red tone, I could choose here the type of red that I wanted, and it shows up right in this little box. Or I could click on that box and use a color picker and slide around and look for one. Click enter. And then I can just change it with this slider. And then how much of that color appears. See, I'm going to go with like a green blue in my shadows. Make it look all 60s. And then in my highlights, I can choose a separate color. And then with this balance, you can sort of shift everything from one direction to the other. And that'll allow you to sort of balance between these two in your overall image. When you do it, it sort of reminds you of editing your white balance, but in a different way. White balance is a way of setting your overall color balance by using a neutral point, and of course you can mess it up any way you want. Whereas this is sort of overlaying color across your image, almost like you're applying like a layer of gel or a layer of color gel on top of your image. Okay. Again, don't get crazy. Right now my image is all green, so I'm going to get rid of all of this, and I'm going to convert this to black and white for a second. Now in black and white, bring all this down just a tad. My split toning can do things like create a sepia image. Okay? This is how you might see a sepia toned image, maybe on the line, or images that are meant to look older, like a faded photograph. This is one way you can do that. You can adjust the color value of your hue of these hues here and saturations, and then apply it over a black and white photograph, creating different kinds of hues. Now again, you want to be careful because this gets really tacky really quick. But that being said, I've created some nice effects with this. Maybe clients wanted that, or maybe I just want like a slight touch of color to my black and white photograph so that it doesn't feel so grayscale, right? That almost looks black and white, but it's actually not. Right? If I take these away, a huge difference. Just to add a little bit of bump in my highlights, kind of warms it up a little bit. Right? So it can be a nice touch. So split toning is a way to add these hues and saturations to your shadows and highlights over top of your image, whether you're in color, whether you're in black and white. Okay? Okay, guys, there's a lot more to talk about in Lightroom, but that's where we're going to end it today. I hope this is a helpful, sort of more in-depth dive to color editing. Use this demo to explore your prompt a little bit. The prompt in Learning Module 4, of course, isn't worth any points, but I'd love to see you guys edit a photograph both in color and in black and white, and really get into the nitty-gritty of adjusting these colors a little bit, and then post that on the MUIs, and we'll talk about it and see which one we think is better, because of course one of the questions I get so often from students is, oh, should I shoot black and white or should I shoot color? Well, sometimes sometimes the color isn't really worth it, or sometimes the black and white really doesn't do what beautiful color can. So let's edit one of each, and we'll take a look. All right, have fun, guys. Talk to you later.